Hello, this is Jackie again, and forgot to hit the record button today on my lecture during class on network effects. And so I am now back in my living room at 6 o'clock on Thursday night doing the lecture again for myself just for fun so that I can actually hit the record button. And I just would like to tell you that even though Alex prompted me in class, are we recording? And I said, oh yeah, we're recording. I was not recording. So thank you, Alex, for prompting me. And will you please keep prompting me? And next time say, let's double check that that little recording light is actually on as you're doing this. So I don't have to do a third time of recording a lecture that I forgot to hit the record on. So here we go, network effects. You might recall that I introduced network effects during the opening lecture about the way in which high-tech industries differ from traditional industries. And I'm currently working on getting my screen share for the slides. Remember, you will find this set of slides in your introductory slide deck 1 that is the continuation from our discussion of market uncertainty, technology uncertainty, and competitive volatility, and the differences between incremental and breakthrough innovation and disruptive innovation. So this set of slides is in that same slide deck. You will see that I've added an additional bullet here that I asked students to write down during class because I realized as I was doing my lecture today at 2 with the students that I did not have the precise definition of a direct network effect. There are 2 types of network effects in high technology industries. The first one is a direct network effect. And a direct network effect means that the value that I, as a specific user of a high technology product or service, think of something like Facebook or LinkedIn, or think of something even like our diagram here of a fax machine from, more dated technologies before we were fully digital. The value that I, as an individual, get from using that particular product is a function of how many other people are also using the product. So if there's only 2 people on LinkedIn, the value of the network is pretty small. But as the number of users on any particular network or platform increase, the value increases at an exponential rate. So you'll see this listed in the bullets here under direct network effects. So I've given you the definition of a network effect, and the value is a function of the size of the installed base, where this phrase installed base means directly the number of users on the network. And this value is based primarily when the product or service you're using is a communication tool or a connectivity tool among users, like telephones or social networks. And the direct network effect is calibrated quantitatively through Metcalfe's law, where the value of the network is a function of n squared, where n is the number of users. So if you had to chart this on a graph, you would put the value on the vertical axis, and you would put n, the number of users, on the horizontal axis, and you would draw it as an exponential. So as the number of users goes up, the value goes up exponentially at n squared. So that's the first type of a network effect. The second type of a network effect is an indirect network effect. And the indirect network effect is based on the availability of complementary products on a particular platform. So when we think about something like Facebook, we have filters, we have games, we have apps, things of that nature. And what is the incentive for a developer to build games or apps for those networks? Well, clearly, it's a function of the number of users on the installed base. So you could almost think of this in the way that you think of advertising. Why do advertisers want to place ads on the Super Bowl? It's because of how many eyeballs they can reach. So when we think of this indirect network effect, we need to realize that the value I as a user get from being on a particular platform or from using a device like a computer or a cell phone is a function of what are the apps that are available to use on that particular device. So the examples that I have here are how many games are available for different consoles like the Xbox or the PlayStation. Why did Blu-ray DVD become the predominant standard? It's because they had so many films that were available on the Blu-ray platform. And this leads to a really important question in high-tech markets that are characterized by network effects. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So should we build our hardware first and hope that we get more software programs that are available on it? Or should we develop a whole bunch of music for a particular streaming service and let the complementary products drive the adoption by individual users? And so we're going to come back to this problem, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, in a minute. And it exists across different types of high-tech products. And I've used this, of course, already with electric vehicles in terms of why would you buy an EV if there's not charging infrastructure? Which comes first? Should we build out the charging infrastructure so that EV owners feel confident buying cars, knowing they can charge them? Or do we need to have a lot of cars on the road in order to justify the expense of deploying and building out the charging infrastructure? So this indirect network effect is also very important in driving value. If you're in an industry that's characterized by network effects, there are two key critical success factors. First, it's critically important to figure out how you can grow the size of the installed base and get as many users as possible using your platform. Because once you have a huge number of users, it becomes a very strong source of competitive advantage. And it's one of the reasons that we see on Facebook, for example. Facebook started primarily as a network among Ivy League East Coast schools, such as Harvard, where Mark Zuckerberg ostensibly invented the Facebook. That's what it was called at the time. And you had to have a .edu address to use it. And then as the realization came that the value was really a function of how many people were using it, it was broadened to all universities. And then pretty soon, you didn't even need to have a .edu address to sign up for Facebook. Anybody could use it. And once we get this huge installed base, it becomes what's called a de facto monopoly, where a de facto monopoly evolves organically simply based on the popularity of the number of customers who are using that platform or that network. And it's very different than when we see a monopoly that starts because of predatory intent of the managers in the business who are documented as saying that they're trying to engage in anti-competitive behavior and limit the number of choices for customers. So the impact is the same, but the difference is the de facto monopoly grows simply because of the network effect. And it is very difficult once we have that network effect to unseat it, because a new competitor would have to come in and essentially equal the value of the installed base, which is next to impossible to do. So companies that say, hey, anybody could be the next Facebook, It's really disingenuous to say that, particularly for a tech company, because they know that the de facto monopoly power they have is not at all easy to unseat. And simply coming up with another innovation alone is insufficient. A second factor that's critically important for an industry characterized by a network effect is to establish industry standards for interoperability. And when I use the word industry standards in technology, I am not talking about quality standards. I am not talking about service level standards. I am talking about protocols by which my hardware will play nicely with your software. Or if you're on an Apple Macintosh and you're doing a Word document, can you send it via email to me on my Microsoft product, and I'll be able to open your document without losing a bunch of formatting and having kind of wonky tables. So these industry standards are based on interoperability or technical compatibility. And as we can see in the picture here, this picture shows how strong the network effects operate. This comes from the 3rd edition of our book, and I'm going to start with the description on the lower right-hand side with the box that says increased number of users. And what you'll see, that box has an arrow that is called due to the direct network effect. We know from the definition that as I get more users on my platform, that it's going to increase the value to each user. So that was the definition of a direct network effect. And I had that diagram of the old-fashioned telephones showing how those n-squared network effects work. As each value gets more user, you can see that it drives an increased likelihood of adoption of additional customers. Please forgive my typo on adoption there. And so we have this first internal virtuous cycle that as I get more users, I drive the network effect. And as I drive the network effect, I'm more likely to get more users. Simultaneously, that increase in the number of users, that lower right-hand box, also is key to driving the incentive for the developers of the apps and the software and the music and all the other things that are available on a particular platform. So this outer loop is due to the indirect effect. And as I have more and more products that plug into my particular hardware or my network, it also increases the value to each user. And so we have this outer cycle of driving an increased adoption based on the complementary products that are available on a particular network or platform. Now, what makes this virtuous cycle happen from the outset is in the upper left-hand corner, where you see the need to establish industry standards. And as defined, industry standards put us all in an area where it doesn't matter which particular network I'm on, they're all going to have this interoperability. And for those of you who are working in digital advertising, you know that you can't scrape data from Google because the way you get that data and what it's linked to is very different than the way you scrape data from Facebook, for example. And so these lack of industry standards across Amazon, Facebook, and Google, which are the primary platforms for online advertising right now, you can't compare and contrast the effectiveness of your advertising because there's no agreed upon industry standard to make that data kind of consistent and compatible. So the idea of establishing industry standards is critically important, and there are 2 key ways that this can be done. The first way it can be done is through an industry consortium. Savannah ended our class on Tuesday about blockchain, wondering, well, if we need to have this consistent industry standard so that everybody's using similar underlying technology for blockchain, how does that actually happen? Well, the blockchain article said that there was a consortium of 200 financial institutions that were getting together to try to ensure some compatibility with respect to the way the blockchains were set up in the financial industry. So this idea of establishing industry standards can be done through an industry consortium. A second way industry standards can be established is through what's called a go-it-alone process, where one company decides they've got the best technology, their standard's going to become the de facto standard, come hell or high water. An example of this would be Sony, for example, when they came out with Blu-ray. They knew in advance that the Blu-ray standard was incompatible with the HD DVD standard that Toshiba and other companies were using. And so anytime movies or programming was made available for DVDs, and you may remember this when you were growing up as kids, you either had to buy your movies on Blu-ray or buy them on HD DVD, and you sometimes couldn't get the movies you wanted because they weren't available in the platform that you had. They weren't compatible with your DVD player. And Sony essentially said, I'm going to do this myself, and I'm going to ensure there's so much content available on Blu-ray that I'm going to swamp this indirect network effect in the industry, and I'm going to drive the HD DVD, the competing standard, out. And ultimately they did. So this role of establishing industry standards is because customers want to be assured that the products that they buy are not going to be obsolete next month or next year because they bought the wrong standard. There's a very classic example in high tech, which is probably from your grandparents' era, which is the Betamax versus VHS video players. And half the population bought Betamax and half the population bought VHS. And lo and behold, VHS won the standards war. And as a result, anybody who had bought a Betamax pretty much had to throw it away and go and buy a VHS, because if you're going to watch movies at home, they were all on VHS. So customers want compatibility so that they don't buy the wrong product that loses the standards war. So an increase in compatibility lowers the FUD factor for consumers. And so this establishment of industry standards is a really important way to jumpstart this network effect. And it's really interesting to me that we see the electric vehicle industry that has 3 competing industry standards in terms of plug types. And Tesla did decide to go it alone. They have built out completely their own charging infrastructure, 100% on their own dime, whereas Nissan and Chevy are relying on third-party players to build out the charging infrastructure. But whatever they build, they're going to have to double their capital expense because there's 2 competing plug types. So it really lowers the incentive for these charging infrastructure providers because they're only going to get half the market share, or they're going to have to double their fixed cost investment. Okay, so there's a second meaning of the word platform, and I want to make sure that you're aware of it because it can be a little bit confusing. Platforms are a type of innovation in high-tech business models. So you might hear this called platform competition or platform innovations. And many of us today look at a platform as something like an app, such as Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, VRBO, where 2 different groups of people, the Airbnb providers that have the rooms and the people who want them, or the drivers who drive and the passengers who need rides, these 2 groups of providers and users meet on the digital app to offer solutions and find solutions to their needs. And so this type of business model innovation is different than when I'm talking about platforms for interoperability or standardization. So we see that Uber, for example, is different than Lyft, and you have different apps. And so yes, it does lead to this bifurcation in the market, but in this case, it's different than the network effect, because as long as I have enough drivers driving and the drivers have enough passengers using it, they're going to be financially solvent. Platforms can also refer to an existing company like Nike, for example, or Starbucks, who are building their own platforms to enhance user experiences where they can communicate with each other. So Nike's trying to build a health and wellness platform so that it has a stronger customer engagement, and that way when you think of Nike, you think of more than just a place where you buy shoes or athletic apparel. Now, this meaning of platform is different than the one that I talked about in terms of these rules for interoperability that you see here with the example of the different plug types. The Tesla plug is on the left and the Nissan plug is on the right. This also exists in operating systems. So if you're on computers, we know that there are different operating systems for computers, especially in the business world between Linux and Microsoft. We know that on phones, there are different operating systems, Android versus iOS. And again, if you're a developer, you have to have different application protocol interfaces. These are called APIs that allow you to program your apps or your software for one platform versus another. So really fundamental to ensuring your industry standard becomes widely used is getting these complementers, and that requires APIs, application protocol interfaces, that you give to the developers to ensure that they have the necessary tools to build on your platform. So if I'm an app developer, I'd much rather just have one platform that I'm building for rather than having to do everything twice. Kind of like me having to record my videos twice because I forgot to hit the record button. When we have competing platforms, this should be clear from my prior discussion, it poses complications for customers. And for high technology, anything that complicates decision-making for customers essentially means that they wait and see and they don't put their money down as quickly as vendors would like. Customers don't want to purchase a product that doesn't become the dominant design. And these two-sided markets like Uber, for example, also face a chicken or egg situation where we have to have the right number of passengers in order to incentivize drivers to sign up. But if we don't have enough drivers, the users won't use the platform and there will be negative word of mouth that we can never get a driver on Uber. So when a company like Uber enters a community like Missoula, they do a very careful analysis of what the expected demand might be, and then they ensure that they sign up a certain number of drivers before they actually launch. And just an interesting story here. I actually signed up to be an Uber driver when it came to Missoula because I really wanted the service, and so they counted me as a driver, even though I rarely was an Uber driver. It was more of a novelty experiment for me, and my students were always worried that they were going to get me as a driver at, 2 a.m. on a weekend, and I said I would never drive at 2 a.m. on a weekend unless it was my children home calling me to be their drunk driver pickup. So anyway, this idea of the two-sided platform is a very unique consideration, and I already have a student in this class who's going to be exploring the idea of a platform for fly fishing in the state of Montana for his project in this class for the semester. Now, platforms can be open in the sense like Android that anybody can build on them, or they can be proprietary like Apple, where they have to approve everything that is done. So I just would like you to note that there's a difference between open and closed platforms, but I'm not going to go into that detail here. Okay, let me just think here. One way to amplify the speed with which to get this installed base is to make sure you have free offerings, which is very difficult to do if you've spent a lot of money on R&D. You can also license your technology to other industry players, which is what Android has done. They've licensed Android, even though it's technically not a license per se. But by having lots of phone companies who build on Android, they're hoping to become the de facto standard. And the best technology may not win the standards war. And I already mentioned the monopolistic issue here. And I've already mentioned that great technology can't unseat a network effect. It's very difficult to do. It's why Microsoft has been so long-lived in the computer industry, part of the reason. Okay, so you are now an expert on network effects. The other things that we did in class today is I showed a video on Elon Musk's Neuralink that I will post in the Slack channel for you. It was just because it was really fascinating. There won't be any testing over that at all. I also did a lecture on quantum computing, and I will post my slides in my document for that. I used it as an example of what you might want to do for your technology project in my class if you want to do an overview of an emerging technology. I did suggest that the Neuralink, the human brain interface, would be a really interesting potential project. And then I did assign your assignment for Monday, September 7th at noon. It is to listen to a 40-minute lecture over the weekend, which is posted on Moodle under the segment Innovation Ecosystem, and to apply the concept of an innovation ecosystem to 5G technology, and to submit a write-up by noon on Monday on Moodle regarding the innovation ecosystem for 5G technology. Slack me if you have questions on that after you look at the assignment details on Moodle. Thanks, and have a great 3-day weekend.